Imagine waking up one day to find that your life is no longer yours. Your bank account is empty, your credit score is ruined, your name stolen. And somewhere, a stranger is living as you, spending your money, walking in your shoes, erasing your existence piece by piece. These are not just stories. They are real crimes, real lives destroyed by deception. These are the chilling tales of the most notorious identity thieves, criminals who became someone else, ghosts who walked among us, stealing names, stealing lives, and sometimes never getting caught. From a man who faked his own death to escape his past, to a con artist who lived as a Rockefeller, these cases are more than just fraud. They are stories of manipulation, betrayal, and the terrifying power of a stolen identity. Prepare yourself, because the next identity they steal could be yours. The Chameleon, Frédéric Bourdin. The phone call came unexpectedly. A boy had been found in Spain, a terrified lost teenager claiming to be Nicholas Barkley, the 13-year-old boy who had vanished from his home in Texas 3 years earlier. The voice on the other end of the line trembled as he described the horrors he had endured. Kidnapped, trafficked across Europe, beaten into submission by his captors. A part of a dark and secret network of abusers who had taken his identity, stripped him of his childhood, and broken him into silence. But somehow, he had escaped. And now, after all these years, he just wanted to come home. His family was in shock. His mother wept. His sister couldn't believe it. They had feared the worst, that Nicholas was dead. But now, against all odds, their boy had come back. The US Embassy confirmed his story. He was issued emergency paperwork, given a plane ticket, and prepared to return to Texas. There was only one problem. The boy was not Nicholas Barkley. He was Frédéric Bourdin, a 23-year-old Frenchman, a serial imposter who had spent his life slipping into the skins of missing children. For years, he had traveled across Europe, stealing the identities of lost boys, each new persona allowing him to escape his own empty life. He infiltrated orphanages, social services, and homes of grieving families. But now, he was attempting his most dangerous deception yet. He was about to steal the life of an American boy who had disappeared without a trace, and everyone believed him. When Bourdin arrived in Texas, there were immediate doubts. Nicholas's hair had been blonde. Bourdin's was naturally dark brown, but he dyed it to match. Nicholas had bright blue eyes. Bourdin's were dark brown, but he told them his kidnappers had chemically altered them to conceal his identity. His accent sounded European, his mannerisms were off, and his body language didn't match the boy they remembered. But grief is a strange thing. People see what they want to see. His mother welcomed him home. She hugged him, sobbed in his arms. His sister showed him old photos, reminded him of their childhood together. Nicholas had been a troubled kid, a boy who had run away before. His behavior had always been erratic. His mother blamed his trauma for his differences. People convinced themselves that time changes people, that suffering warps a person's identity. And so Bourdin slipped into Nicholas's life. He slept in his bed, ate at his table, walked the streets of his town. But deception is fragile, and soon the cracks began to show. A private investigator named Charlie Parker started looking into Nicholas's return. Something about his story felt wrong. The way he dodged details, the way he never quite fit into his old life. Parker compared Nicholas's old photos with the boy who had returned. The ear shape was different, the facial structure didn't match, but the final clue was in his eyes. There was no scientific way to permanently change blue eyes to brown, not with trauma, not with chemicals. It was impossible. Parker went to the FBI. They began their own investigation, pulling medical records, fingerprinting Bourdin behind the scenes. And then, the illusion shattered. DNA tests confirmed the truth. This was not Nicholas Barkley. It was Frédéric Bourdin, a career imposter, a man who had stolen over 500 identities across the world. When federal agents arrived at Nicholas's home, Bourdin didn't run. He just sat there, waiting. He was arrested on passport fraud and perjury charges, but even as he was taken into custody, he never showed fear. He had known this day would come, and when investigators demanded answers, he simply smiled. "They wanted to believe," he said, "and I gave them what they wanted." It was chilling, because in a way, he was right. Grief had blinded Nicholas's family. They had willed themselves into believing a stranger was their lost child. They had let the impostor in. Bourdin was sentenced to 6 years in prison. But when he was released, he did it again. He traveled across Europe, slipping into the lives of other missing children. Each time he became someone new. Because for Bourdin, identity was a game, a mask he could change at will. And to this day, somewhere in the world, he might still be watching, waiting, for his next stolen life. The devil in uniform, Arthur Williams Jr. He had perfected the art of deception. When Arthur Williams Jr. walked into a bank, dressed in full military uniform, the world saw a war hero, a man who had served his country, who had fought and bled on distant battlefields. He carried himself with the quiet confidence of a veteran. His voice had the edge of a man who had seen things no one should see. He knew exactly how to tilt his head, how to let his voice crack at the right moment when talking about the men we lost. People believed him. Bank tellers smiled, thanking him for his service before approving his loan applications. Veterans organizations handed him financial aid without hesitation. The Department of Veterans Affairs sent him government checks. He walked into military hospitals and claimed benefits meant for real soldiers, men who had actually been in war zones, who had scars, both visible and invisible. But Arthur had never spent a single day in the military. He had never endured boot camp, never held a rifle in a combat zone, never watched a friend die in his arms. And yet, for over 2 decades, he lived as a veteran, collecting money, receiving praise, gaining respect that he had not earned. It had started small. One day, while working a dead-end job, he realized just how much respect military personnel received. He saw the way people trusted them, how they treated them as heroes. He thought, why not me? So he bought a uniform. He studied the military, its ranks, its customs, its language. He memorized war stories from documentaries and books, learned the way real veterans spoke about their experiences. He practiced their mannerisms, their haunted expressions, the way they carried the weight of war on their shoulders. Then he started using stolen identities, real soldiers' names, real veterans' social security numbers. He applied for military loans, mortgages, pensions, and disability benefits. The money flowed in, and no one questioned him. He perfected his act. He would walk into a bank, straight-backed, uniform crisp, medals shining on his chest. He spoke in low, measured tones, mentioning deployments in Iraq, Afghanistan, or Vietnam, whichever war matched the identity he was using. Sometimes he would fake a limp, telling stories of injuries sustained in combat. Sometimes he would wipe imaginary tears from his eyes, speaking of brothers in arms lost in battle. It was flawless. He stole millions of dollars. But the more he got away with, the greedier he became. At first it was just a few $1,000s here and there, but soon he started applying for larger loans, $50,000, $100,000 more. He walked into different banks across multiple states, using different names, different service records. And then he made a mistake. A bank officer noticed something odd. His service record looked too perfect, every box checked, every requirement met with unnatural precision. It was too clean. She made a call. The inquiry led to another. Another bank was contacted, then another. The Department of Veterans Affairs was notified. A background check was conducted. The result was shocking. There was no official record of Arthur Williams Jr. having ever served. The walls began to close in. The FBI launched a full investigation. For months, they followed him. They watched as he continued to walk into banks, to collect stolen money with a smile. They tracked his movements, his aliases, his spending habits, and finally, they made their move. One cold morning, just outside of Houston, federal agents surrounded the rundown motel where he was staying. Inside, they found an entire world of deception. Stacks of forged military IDs covered the desk. Uniforms from multiple military branches hung in the closet. Fake service records were neatly filed in folders, ready for use. Medals, stolen valor, lay carefully arranged on a dresser. When they kicked in the door, he didn't fight. He didn't plead. He just sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor. "You fooled a lot of people," one of the agents said. Arthur finally looked up. He smirked. "It was easy," he admitted. The trial was swift. His victims testified against him, real veterans whose names he had stolen, men who had served with honor while he lived off their sacrifices. Some had lost their homes because of loans taken out in their names. Others had been denied benefits because their records showed payments already claimed. By him, the judge was ruthless. Arthur Williams Jr. was sentenced to federal prison, his years of deception finally catching up to him. His medals were stripped. His fake records were burned in court. But the real punishment. For years, he had built a life out of stolen identities, stolen honor, stolen respect. And now, for the first time in decades, he was no one. Maybe that was the worst punishment of all. The man who never existed, Christopher Rocancourt. The man in the tailored suit smiled, his Rolex catching the light as he reached across the table to shake hands with another investor. His voice was smooth, his confidence effortless. He was Christopher Rocancourt, French aristocracy, old money, a Rockefeller by blood. He had properties in Paris, a private jet waiting in Geneva, and exclusive investment opportunities that only a select few were lucky enough to hear about. His new mark, a wealthy Hollywood producer, leaned in, intrigued. Rocancourt swirled his wine, speaking of European banking secrecy and offshore accounts, promising exponential returns. The man listened, nodding, eager to invest. Another victim, another fortune waiting to be stolen. But Christopher Rocancourt was not a Rockefeller. He was not an aristocrat. In truth, he had no inheritance, no wealth, no trust fund. The entire persona he had crafted was a work of fiction. The man sitting across the table had no idea that he was shaking hands with a ghost. He had been born into poverty, raised in the slums of France. His father was a violent alcoholic, his mother a struggling prostitute. By the time he was a teenager, he had run away from home, already learning the tricks of deception, how to manipulate, how to make people believe a lie, how to steal without ever touching a wallet. He started small, scamming shopkeepers, forging checks, sweet-talking his way into places he didn't belong. But soon, the local scams weren't enough. He had bigger ambitions. At 18, he stole the identity of a wealthy businessman, gaining access to bank accounts that weren't his. He forged documents, rewrote his past, and started traveling across Europe, living in luxury hotels without paying a cent. But even that wasn't enough. He wanted more. America was where the real money was. Rocancourt arrived in the United States in the 1990s, slipping effortlessly into the elite circles of Los Angeles. He became Christopher Rockefeller, an heir to one of the richest families in history. The name alone opened doors. He walked into exclusive Hollywood parties, rubbing shoulders with celebrities, producers, and politicians. He dined with the rich, sat in rooms where millions were discussed in casual conversation, and charmed people into handing him their money. Investors wired him funds for ventures that didn't exist. Lawyers signed contracts for properties that were never his. Women fell in love with the fantasy, believing they had finally found a man who had it all. And the best part? No one questioned him. He spoke with the elegance of old money, dressed like a billionaire, and carried himself with the unshakable certainty of someone who had never had to worry about a thing. His greatest trick was never acting like a man pretending to be rich. He acted like a man who had never known anything else. But the truth was catching up to him. Whispers spread. Some people had given him money but never saw returns. A few of his supposed business ventures began to collapse. Then, one day in Canada, someone recognized him. A man he had once scammed saw him dining at an expensive restaurant, laughing, sipping champagne, speaking of his European estate. The man called the police. They began investigating. What they uncovered was astonishing. Rocancourt had conned millions out of Hollywood executives, bankers, and socialites. He had lived in Beverly Hills mansions without ever paying rent. He had bounced between identities, using different names, each one leading to another trail of deception. The FBI got involved. The list of his crimes grew. The chase had begun. For months, Rocancourt evaded authorities, slipping through borders, forging new identities as easily as changing suits. But the walls were closing in. In 2001, they caught him. In a small Canadian motel, alone, without his wealth, without his persona, the man who had stolen lives was finally unmasked. During the trial, his victims spoke of ruined lives, lost fortunes, betrayals that shattered trust forever. A woman he had promised to marry broke down in tears on the witness stand. A producer who had handed him $500,000 spoke of losing everything. And yet, as Rocancourt sat in court, listening to their words, he simply smirked. The sentence came down, 5 years in prison. But even behind bars, he was still Rocancourt. He wrote a memoir. He sold the rights to his story. He made money off the very deception that had destroyed so many. And when he was released, he walked free, richer than ever. Because in the end, people still wanted to believe in the fantasy. Even after everything, they still wanted to believe in him. The Stranger in Your Home. PHILLIP Cummings. It started with a single keystroke. A man sitting at a computer, staring at rows of sensitive data. Names, addresses, social security numbers, thousands of identities at his fingertips. The people behind them were unaware that their lives were about to be stolen, their futures sold to the highest bidder. PHILLIP Cummings knew exactly what he was doing. For years, he had worked as a help desk employee for a software company that provided banks with credit reporting data. Every day, he handled highly confidential information, the kind of data that determined who could buy a house, who could open a bank account, and who could be trusted with money. He wasn't particularly skilled, nor was he a mastermind hacker. He didn't need to be. He simply had access, and access was power. The temptation was too great. At first, it was just a few files. He copied names and sold them to identity thieves for small amounts of cash. It was easy. Too easy. No one noticed, so he escalated. Over time, Cummings sold more than 30,000 identities. Each sale was a new crime, a new life ruined. For 3 years, he funneled stolen personal data into the hands of criminal organizations. He didn't know their names, didn't ask questions. He didn't care what happened to the people whose information he was selling. Some had their credit cards maxed out overnight. Some had loans taken out in their names, leaving them drowning in debt they never created. Some had their homes foreclosed because mortgages had been fraudulently filed using their stolen details. But the worst part, most of them didn't realize it until it was too late. One day, a woman in Texas opened her mailbox and found a bill for a car she had never purchased. She called the dealership, confused, only to be told that she had personally signed the paperwork weeks ago. Except she hadn't. A man in New York woke up to find that he was $150,000 in debt. He had never applied for any loans, but banks were calling, demanding payments on accounts he never opened. Their identities had been sold, their lives had been stolen, and somewhere PHILLIP Cummings was counting his money. The scheme should have lasted forever. He was careful, never too greedy, never too obvious. But then he made a mistake. One of his criminal buyers got sloppy. a routine fraud investigation traced stolen data back to a suspiciously large number of identity theft cases. Law enforcement noticed that the fraudulent transactions were all linked to one specific software company, Cummings' employer. The company launched an internal review. They cross-checked access logs, searching for employees who had retrieved the most files. One name stood out: Philip Cummings. The FBI took over. For months they followed him, watching where he went, tracking his finances. They pulled his records. They listened to his calls. They watched him spend money he shouldn't have had. Then, one evening, as he left a restaurant, 2 agents approached him. "Mr. Cummings," one of them said, flashing a badge, "we need to talk." The investigation uncovered a staggering level of fraud. He had made millions selling stolen identities, but the true damage was incalculable. Thousands of victims, hundreds of ruined lives, families left in financial ruin. When the case went to trial, the courtroom was filled with victims, people whose credit was destroyed, whose savings had been wiped out, who had spent years trying to fix a problem they never caused. They looked at him with rage, heartbreak, disbelief. One man stood up, his voice shaking. "Do you have any idea what you did to my family?" Cummings didn't answer. Because what could he say? That he was sorry, that it was just business, that it wasn't personal. To them it was very personal. The judge did not show mercy. Philip Cummings was sentenced to 14 years in federal prison. But even that felt too little for what he had done, because some of his victims would never recover. And the scariest part, even after his arrest, even after his conviction, the stolen identities were still out there. Bought, sold, passed from one criminal to another. A nightmare without an end. Because once your name is stolen, sometimes you never get it back. The man who vanished into his own lie, John Darwin. The sea was restless the day John Darwin disappeared. The wind howled, waves crashed violently against the shore, and the sky was a dull, lifeless grey. It was supposed to be a routine kayaking trip, something he had done many times before. But this time, John never returned. Hours passed, then days. A search party was launched. Helicopters combed the waters, boats trawled the coastline, and divers plunged into the icy depths, hoping for a miracle. But there was nothing. His broken kayak washed ashore, a silent clue in a tragedy that was already writing itself. His wife, Anne, was inconsolable. His sons, devastated. The authorities, resigned to the truth. John Darwin had drowned. But John Darwin wasn't dead. He was hiding in his own home. For months, he stayed in the house they had shared, slipping through the back door whenever visitors arrived, living like a ghost in the walls of his own life. Only Anne knew the truth. It had all been a lie, a fraudulent disappearance, a carefully planned hoax to escape the crushing weight of debt that was suffocating them. John and Anne had owed thousands, drowning in financial ruin. The banks were circling. Creditors were knocking. There was only one way out. Insurance money. John's death meant a £250,000 life insurance payout, enough to erase their debt, to start over, to live again. So, he vanished. Anne played her part perfectly. She wept through interviews, accepted condolences, and filed the insurance claims, while John listened from another room. For 5 years he lived in hiding. He stayed close, always just out of reach. At night, he would slip into the house, eating meals in silence, watching the news of his own death. But the walls began to close in. He couldn't stay hidden forever. The plan had been to wait a few years, then slip away under a new identity. But John was growing restless. He hated being invisible. He wanted his life back. And so in 2007, he walked into a police station and said the words no one expected. "I think I'm a missing person." The officers stared at him, confused. They asked for his name. "John Darwin," he said. For a moment there was silence. then disbelief, then chaos. The world thought he had drowned in 2002, and here he was, standing in a police station, very much alive. His story was absurd. He claimed he had suffered from amnesia, had woken up with no memory of who he was, and had been wandering the streets for years. But there was one problem: a photograph. It had surfaced online, a photo of John and Anne, taken in Panama, smiling together, years after his death. The insurance investigators had seen it, the authorities had seen it, and now there was no escape. Anne cracked first. She confessed everything: the lie, the insurance fraud, the years of deception. John had no choice but to follow. The courtroom was packed. The story had captivated the world. A man who faked his death, a wife who played the grieving widow, a fortune stolen through fraud. But the most shocking betrayal came from their own sons. Mark and Anthony Darwin had believed their father was dead. They had mourned him, grieved for him, struggled with the loss of a parent they would never see again. Now they sat in the courtroom, unable to look him in the eye. "You have no idea what you've done to us," one of them said. John Darwin, for all his planning, had never thought about that. The judge was merciless. Both John and Anne were sentenced to 6 years in prison for fraud. But the real punishment wasn't the prison time. It was losing everything. The money was gone. Their home was taken. Their sons disowned them. By the time John was released, he was truly alone. He had spent years trying to vanish, and in the end, he succeeded. Because when he walked free, he had no life left to return to.